Is the position I'm showing you right now a win for white or is it a draw? Does it matter if it's white to move or black to move? And what about this one, for example? And what about this one? Do you know how many endgames like these you lost but could have drawn? And how many endgames like these you drew but could have won? Someone who knows their endgames can tell in an instant if a position is a draw or a win. They will not have needed to pause the video as I was switching the positions around. So if you want to join this elite club of legendary people and get as many points from these endgames as you possibly can, welcome to my video. So yeah, greetings my fellow peace blunderers, and today we're finally starting to talk about endgames, the most basic ones, but you've got to start somewhere. Today is all about king and pawn versus king. Also, a small note, today we're discussing non-rook pawns. The A pawns and the H pawns are not following the rules we're about to discuss. However, all the other pawns from B to G, they all work. The rook pawns are always a bit trickier in the endgames. That is why a separate video is going to be dedicated to it, don't miss. So to first answer my own question, this position as well as this position as well as this position are all draws no matter who moves. But you still need to know how to draw them. It's relatively easy, that's why it's being covered in the very first video in the series, but you still need to know how to do it. To better understand how to draw these positions, I really strongly recommend you not to think in terms of how do I draw this, but modify this thought a bit to how do I not let white win? This is important because to answer this question, we need to know, well, how does white win in these positions? What is the winning condition for white here? Now, let me briefly switch to this position, and this is a very typical example of a landslide win for white, no matter which side moves. The winning condition for white in these sort of endgames, king versus king and pawn, is the following. The white king, at any moment in a position, is able to step onto one of the three squares that I highlighted in blue for you just now. These are called the critical squares, and they are actually quite flexible. It doesn't mean that the white king always needs to go to d5, e5, and f5. No. What we are talking about when we talk about critical squares is the three squares 2 ranks in front of the pawn. For example, we have a pawn on e3, right? That's why to look for critical squares, we need to look at e5 and the neighboring squares on the left and on the right, so d5 and f5. If we go back to this position, for example, what would be the critical squares here? You can pause if you want. So the answer to this question is very simple. If we want to win here for white, which is again impossible if black plays it correctly, but if we want to win, we would be looking at the following. The pawn is on e4, so we're looking 2 ranks ahead. We're looking at e6 and the neighboring squares on the left and on the right, d6 and f6. Honestly, that's the wrong color. There you go. And as soon as the white king gets onto one of these 3 squares, doesn't matter which one, white wins automatically, again, as long as white has the necessary technique. So like in very simple terms, all you need to do for black here to draw is to not let the white king to go past their pawn too much. And for white to win, well, you need to go past your pawn too much. What we have established is that what white wants to do, they want to get to these squares. What black wants to do, they do not want white to get to these squares. And for black to successfully do that, they need to use the so-called opposition, a very, very important notion in endgame theory. What is the opposition? Well, let me show you a good example. Let's imagine that here it's white to move. The only 2 moves that do not lose a pawn are king d3 and king f3. King d2, king e2, and king f2 are no good enough for a very obvious reason. Black just takes the pawn on the next move. So let's say white chooses to play king d3. You know, he's a left-handed person, moving left is far more natural. And from here, black has got 4 legal moves. King d6, king e6, king f6, and king f4. King f4 is obviously no good because after king f4, we allow white to get what they want, is to get onto one of the 3 critical squares, so black will lose. King d6, king e6, and king f6 on the other hand, all 3 of them draw. However, I always strongly recommend the easiest and probably the purest way to draw ring is that you move your king up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And I will just in a second explain why. So let's play king e6, as I told you, up and down, okay? Actually, let me quickly switch, if you don't mind, to this perspective, because right now we're looking at it mostly from black's shoes. So white plays king d4 now, and we ask ourselves a question. We just played last move down the board. Can we possibly play back up? Remember this up and down, up and down, up and down thing I mentioned? Just like your self-esteem does as you age. And the answer is, of course, no, because the white king is preventing you from going to e5. So we cannot do up and down, up and down, up and down anymore. So what do we do? Now this is where the opposition comes into play. You create the opposition when you move your king opposite the opponent's king in a way that only one square is the difference between you. And the reason the opposition is a crucial defensive mechanism is that when you create the opposition, the other side now has to move, and when it does have to move, their king cannot possibly advance forward. You're blocking all the 3 squares from them. The white king really wants to go beyond their pawn, but it cannot because your king is just standing in the way. So when people cannot move forward with their king, what they usually do is they start moving forward with their pawn, this time with check, e5, coming with check. And what we do now is simply go back in front of the pawn so the pawn cannot advance any further. From this position, any other legal move that white has except for e4 loses the e5 pawn. That's why white is more or less forced to play king e4. A very familiar looking position, isn't it? Especially if I flip it back to the way it used to be at the start of the video and compare it to the original position, just like so. Huh? Looks familiar. The position is absolutely identical to what we had before, as I just move it up and down like a toddler shaking a bottle of milk, and the outcome is still the same, a dead draw. Let me just flip it back. It's black to move, and what do? Exactly, up and down. King e7. Now, if you remember, in a similar position to this, just a rank higher, white played their king to this side, and we created the opposition, and this is how we got to here. What if white tries to be tricky and tries not to go forward, but maybe to the side or back? Let's say, I don't know, king d4. Now, you cannot create the opposition because the pawn is not allowing you to d6, so that's a bit of a nasty one, but what do? Up and down, correct, king e6. And yet again, every other legal move other than king e4 will lose the e5 pawn, so white is forced to play king e4, and we achieve the same position that we just had. Up and down, king e7, king f5, going to this side this time. Ooh, tricky. Never mind, we create the opposition, yet again, not allowing the white king anywhere near the critical squares, and if this time around they decide to check us again, what do we do after check? Correct, we go back in front of the pawn. Now let's just finish this position with king e5, up and down, king e8, king d6. We cannot play up and down because e7 is occupied, so we play the opposition with king to d8, and now white checks us with e7. We go in front of the pawn when we get checked, and now any move that white plays is going to be a draw. Any legal move that white can play will either result in a pawn loss or a stalemate, right? So for example, stalemate is achieved after king e6, and this is a draw because our king is blocked from any possible squares, either by the pawn or by the opponent king. And if white does not play king e6, play something else, we just capture the pawn and draw anyway. So 3 things to take out of this. Up and down, up and down, up and down. That's 1. 2, when we cannot go up and down, up and down, up and down, we create the opposition. And 3, when we get checked, we move in front of the pawn. And now that you know all this, our second position is going to be a piece of cake for you. Let's flip it back so that we see it from black's perspective. And with white to move, let's say, where do I play? Let's play, I don't know. Let's play king c4. All right. What do we do now? You can pause the video to find the best drawing move. And the answer is going to be our best up and down, up and down, up and down is king c6, right? And the way this draw is likely going to happen is something like king b4. We cannot create the opposition because the b6 square is blocked. So we play up and down, up and down, up and down. King c7. And now king b5, king b7, the opposition checks. When we get checked, we play in front of the pawn, king c5, up and down, king c8, king d6, king d8, the opposition, we get checked. When we checked in front of the pawn, and now it's going to be stalemate after king c6. Now, if you figured the mechanism by now, bravo, applause from the audience. You are just one step closer to ultimate chess mastery. Going to our third position. Now, this is where things are starting to get more tricky. The previous 2 positions were featuring kings very, very close to the pawns. This time, however, the kings are a bit more distant. And as I flip it back, the question is, can black somehow get from this position, a position like this one, the first one that we analyzed, or this one, the second one that we saw? Can black to find a way somehow to not let the white king penetrate any one of these 3 critical squares? Remember those? And the answer is an astounding yes, he can. It's a draw. Now, there are many, many, many ways this position can unfold and end in a draw. For example, with white to move, they can go to any of these squares. Just keep your ultimate goal in mind and try to calculate through it. How do we not allow the white king onto d6, e6, or f6? For example, let's try king d3 and now king f7, trying to get as close to these squares as possible so we can block them. King d4, white is also trying to get to them, and now we play king e6. With our king on e6, we're definitely not allowing white to penetrate to any of these 3 squares, at least for now. So white either has to go to the side slightly forward, or back. If white chooses to play king c5, this is going to be the easiest draw in the world, because after king e5, this pawn is indefensible. It's dropping because the king cannot go back to defend it. All the squares where it can defend it from are blocked. King c4, and we just take king c4, for example, going a bit to the side. Again, we move as close to the pawn as possible. King e5. Now something like king d3 to save the pawn. And again, remember our old strategy, cannot create the opposition right now because the d5 square is blocked. So what we do? Up and down, king e6, and now king d4 is met with the opposition, king d6, and now lots of variants are possible. Check. When we get checked, what do? We move in front of the pawn. And the last move, king e3, is met with again going as close to the pawn as possible, up and down, king e5, and now king d3 cannot create the opposition, so up and down, king e6, and this position again, we just saw king d4, king d6, the opposition goes back, or checks, something like that. It's all going to end in a draw. And now let's look at the final position that we have today from white's perspective. This time, let's actually let them win for once. It's white to move and win, and how do you win? Of course, you want to get to any of the critical squares, d5, e5, or f5. Also, a very important point, which I probably should have mentioned slightly earlier, but in many endgames, not just this one, but in many other endgames, you want to play your king more so than with your pawns or other pieces sometimes even. In a position like this, for example, moving a pawn forward instead of your king is absolutely calamitous, and it will lose you the win immediately. Because as the pawn moves, so do the critical squares. Now the critical squares for that pawn, instead of d5, e5, and f5, are d6, e6, and f6. And these squares are definitely, from this position, absolutely unattainable. But coming back to the original position, let's get back these critical squares, d5, e5, and f5. Here, yes, you can reach them. And let's see how. King d3, let's say king f6. The black king is en route to stop us. And now we play king d4, king e6, seemingly stopping us, right? From e6, the black king is controlling all three critical squares that we're trying to get. With the opposition on the board, the black king is forced to move to any of these 5 squares, and from none of them is the black king able to control d5, e5, and f5. For example, if the black king goes to d6, now we can easily move to f5, one of the 3 critical squares, and now we are going to win. Just let me show you how exactly now the win is really achieved. For example, the black king decides to go to e7. Believe it or not, but if in this position you start pushing your pawn, e4, the position instantly becomes a draw. Because now what black starts doing is they start infinitely creating the opposition. They just keep moving their king side to side, creating the opposition all the time indefinitely, up until a point where you either decide to move the pawn forward or to move your king back. If you move your pawn, for example, now the position is almost identical to the one that we saw before, this one, for example. And yes, it's slightly different, but the essence is still the same. The critical squares are now d7, e7, and f7, and no way is the white king getting to them now. And if you move the king back, well, you're going to face probably another opposition, so you're forced to go back even more. And then this position, well, we definitely saw that, and we saw how that was a draw. So this goes back to our rule: play with your king first and with your pawn second. Instead of moving the pawn forward, try improving your king. And you can do that with another opposition, king e5. Now we are pushing the black king even more, because the black king cannot go to d6, cannot go to e6, cannot go to f6. They have to go, let's say they go to d7, and we take even more space with our king with king f6. And now when our king is in prime position, after something like king d6 from black, we can start finally moving our pawn forward, e4, king d7 from black. We can allow another forward move with the pawn e5. Black wants to be sturdy, king e8. Okay, opposition again, my friend. The king has to go to d8 or f8, let's say d8. And now we go to f7 and we safely escort the pawn to promotion. King d7, e6 check, king d8, e7 check, king d7, and now we promote and win. Remember how important the opposition is for attacking and for defending, and how we want to use it to force the opponent king either to the side or to the back, so we can start going forward with our king. So yeah, if you just so happened to find this video useful, please like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitch. I stream Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays usually. Find me on chess.com, join our Discord, all that good stuff. And that is going to be it, my favorite unintentional gambiteers. I'm going to talk to you very soon. Let me know in the comments what you think of this video. Love you guys. See ya in the next one.